Hello and welcome to the Leading Communities podcast, brought to you by Aspire for You CIC and produced by That's All Media CIC. We're on a mission to understand what it takes to help communities to start caring, keep caring, or care more about an issue.
Hello and welcome to the Leading Communities podcast with Aspire for You. I'm your host, Kit Shawande, and Leading Communities is all about working with professionals, community leaders, and those that care about how do we get people to start caring, keep caring, or care more about a range of issues. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about community engagement and different aspects of community engagement. We are joined by Jody Pritchard. Jody, would you like to say a little bit about yourself and your current role and a bit of a backstory of how you got here?
Yeah, sure. So I currently work in Dudley Council, Programme Manager in Public Health for the Healthy Communities team, and we have a team of community development workers as well as some other staff. But previously, I've worked in the NHS and in the council in a number of roles, starting out working in mental health promotion, which was really interesting, learning about and understanding the things that promote people's mental health and well-being, but also sort of demote their mental health and well-being. And through that work, I realised that people having a voice, people being able to be active citizens in their communities and feel that they had control over shaping their future was actually really, really important to their mental health and well-being. So I moved into some youth participation roles in the council, working with young people for 7 years, which was an absolute privilege and a pleasure really to work with those amazing young people on a number of different programmes such as the Youth Council, the UK Youth Parliament elections, allocating. We had £500,000 that we allocated to projects for young people. So an amazing range of different programmes really. And then I got a bit tired because 7 years of working with very energetic, enthusiastic, passionate young people takes its toll a little bit. So I moved back into a role in the NHS, managing a number of programme areas around public health, but all with a community-centred and a person-centred focus to them. And that's where I've come to today.
Okay, so one thing I'm interested in is any kind of particular career highlights, but I want to just pick up on the bit that you said, because it's very clear you started you worked with a range of people across the community, which I think is going to be very useful to any aspiring social entrepreneurs listening to this, but also any people maybe they've just gotten into a role of public health, community engagement, public engagement. So this is again why we do this. But you spoke about a project where it was about distributing funding. Give us a picture about that, because I'm interested in this concept about how do you put communities in charge.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was called the Youth Opportunities Fund and the Youth Capital Fund. And as I said, we had £500,000. Young people were completely in charge of allocating that money. And it was allocated to projects that were run and led by young people. Obviously, some of it was with support from adults. So we trained up a panel of young people to really understand what they needed to do to allocate the money in a fair and transparent way. They heard from all the young people who had project ideas. They decided what they wanted to fund, and then they kept track of how the young people were getting on with their projects, delivering those projects in their communities. And it was an absolutely fantastic programme. The young people on the panel just got so much out of it, but also obviously all of the young people within their communities who were entrusted really to have sums of money to deliver their own projects.
Okay, so this is really powerful. So are we allowed to ask where the money came from, first of all? Because I want to take people on that journey of understanding how to maybe put one of these together for themselves. So is that DCMS funding, Department for Culture, Media and Sport? Was it more public health? Was it what was the source?
It was government funding. I can't remember the exact programme that it came through now. It was some years ago, but it was at a time where there was a lot of investment in programmes and initiatives for young people and their participation. So I mentioned as well the UK Youth Parliament. That's absolutely fantastic institution that was set up to enable young people to learn about being active citizens and having a voice and campaigning for the issues that really mattered to them. And it was apolitical. It was focused purely around issues, and that again provided many opportunities for young people to sort of step up and get their voices heard.
Amazing. Okay, so the money's then come into Dudley Council. How did you find in charge, but even a rough estimate, how did we find the young people? How many were there? But really importantly, what did some of their training involve so that they knew how to, as opposed to be commissioners, right?
Yeah. So how did we find young people? Well, we just put the word out, really. I was based in the youth service at the time, so we'd got lots of youth workers working in the different communities and youth centres and doing outreach work. We advertised the opportunity through all of the schools and through other young people's settings, and asked young people to express an interest in being on the panel and being part of this really exciting project. And then we had a bit of a selection process, and they sort of shared what they felt they could bring to the process and why they wanted to be involved. And then, yes, they had training and support. So we took them through supporting them to develop an application form and the criteria. There were some criteria attached to the funding, as you'd expect, but thinking about how we related that to the local context, how to allocate funding, as I said, in a fair and transparent way. So being aware of any sort of biases or stereotypes or anything like that, which might cloud their judgment. Thinking about what questions they would want to ask the young people who were sharing their project ideas, and how to score the projects that were put forward. And then thinking about the different types of projects as well, and making sure that they would really benefit the wider communities of young people that the projects were aimed at. So it wasn't obviously just benefiting a few young people, but a wider group within that community.
So you talked a bit about distribution. So if we did just like an adjusted ratio, let's just say we had £100, what kind of guidance were you giving some of the young people? And again, this is useful for some of the people that will be listening, because every time we hear a funding bid comes out, so you'll hear there's £10 million for the sake of ratios. You'll hear there's £100 out for funding. You'll hear that normally the funder will then say, we expect to fund bids in the range of £5, right? Which is kind of meant to exclude, which is basically, we'd love 20 people to have this, providing everyone can stay around the £5. However, they'll also state you can apply for a minimum of 50p up to, I don't know, a tenner. So now everybody in the community hears the tenner, right? Because nobody's like, I don't want to do anything for £2 or whatever. I think, well, if I can get a 10, I can do amazing projects. So how did you guys apportion that 500? Was it in rounds? So would you split the 500k into 5 lots of 100k first? And how many bids and all of that was everyone expecting?
Yeah, so some of it was capital funding and some of it was revenue funding. So the capital funding was obviously for much larger, more expensive projects that the young people did work with adults to submit. And those were things like repairing roofs on like the boxing club building and things like that. There were categories of sort of amounts of funding that people could apply to. I can't remember what those were, to be honest. It was some years ago now. But obviously the young people were looking to see if the project applications were providing value for money and were, asking for sort of reasonable resources and costs that were going to be incurred. And if projects were asking for lots of laptops, for example, then, could they prove that they were going to use them for the things they said they would? What would happen to them at the end of the project? That type of thing. So
yeah, and that's good, because really fundamentally it's something that sits close to my heart, which is how do you develop experiential learning? How do we turn something into not just a paper exercise, but that depth thinking? So again, we've got a pot of money. Part of that, well, we're not going to put it all into one type of thing. you need to think this way, understand this thinking. That layered thinking is really powerful. And then obviously thinking about post-project, some of it is very challenging because, you know, you do need a certain amount of lived experience to understand that not everybody's aspirations come true, you know what I mean? So, and then you're kind of given a tiny bit of steer for young people to, I wouldn't say not even young people, but any commissioners, like maybe not cynicism, but to kind of have a heavy dose of reality, you know what I mean? That this is the plan, but do we believe this type of person, entity, situation can really deliver this plan, which is a really high level kind of thinking at a young age, because you have to make a judgment call relative to your expertise. Some people say that that's part of the weakness of funding, because it's very subjective. Just because they don't think they can doesn't mean I can't, and just because they think I can doesn't mean I can. So, you know, there's always like nuances and subtleties, but that was kind of really interesting, and I'm hoping people are seeing a bit even behind the scenes that some of the funding operations behind the scenes can be taught to the communities, not even just young people, but we could really kind of test that with something around violence against women and girls. You know what I mean? We can test that against sports-related interventions, health-related interventions. There was one thing that I think I'm just trying to retrace. So it was how the portions were kind of distributed, thinking about the nuances. You said, oh yeah, capital funding and revenue funding. Do you just want to break that down for how that's perceived or defined?
So revenue funding would be things for I suppose items that are more consumables or doing trips or activities, that sort of thing. Whereas capital funding was for purchasing larger, more sort of items, as I said, like the new building on the boxing club roof or big pieces of equipment. I mean, there were specific criteria around what was classed as capital and revenue.
No worries. So I think one of the big things there is it's all, not always, but you know, kind of a guided rule of thumb around capital expenditures, as you said, something that's likely to last quite a while. So, you know, solid buildings, certain types of equipment, vans, you know, whatever it is, things got no box longevity. And then revenue funding can then tend to be the cost of a workshop practitioner, cost of a particular trainer, things that are more, kind of shorter term, and we're going to use it in the next 6 months, we're going to use it in less than a year and things like that. But very much skills, workforce, and everything within that financial year to say that's somebody's wages, that's somebody's salary, or that's somebody's freelance fees, etc. Then moving on from that, are there any other parts of your career where that model has been practiced? Have you seen other people testing this with other age groups and other demographics?
Well, it's interesting in terms of allocating money and grants and investment. That's one area where my sort of work has evolved, actually. So when I moved back into the NHS, we had some small grants programs to support voluntary and community groups to lead sort of health promotion type projects. But what I found and what I was very aware of was that sometimes grants programs create a culture of competition. And some groups would be applying for funding, and then the next year they would need to come back for more funding for the same things. And it wasn't particularly sustainable. So I started thinking about ways of moving more towards a model of investment rather than grant making, so that you were really encouraging that sustainability element, but also encouraging greater collaboration between groups, and also encouraging groups to think about what had they already got, what resources had they already got, what could they already use, or what could they access or share with other groups, and utilise those resources before applying for funding for other things, because otherwise you were funding things that perhaps groups had already got access to or could get access to if they worked together with others. So we actually created an initiative called Make It Happen. And Make It Happen is all about supporting grassroots projects people with ideas. They're not quite sure how to get it off the ground. They might just need a tiny little bit of money, but they may need some resources or somebody with some skills or whatever. And what we do is bring people together to share their project ideas, and then everybody in the room offers ideas of how that person or that project can make that idea happen. So what we find is the group may come saying they need £500, but by the end of the event, they might only need £200 because somebody in the room has donated a bench and somebody else has said you can borrow our tools or whatever. And that initiative is really effective at bringing communities together and strengthening communities and enabling them to find ways of collaborating. And it's far more sustainable, and it makes really good use of the resources that we've all got available to us. Now, thinking about commissioning, we actually use that model to scale it up. And we developed a voluntary sector innovation fund programme a few years ago. And that was all about supporting voluntary and community groups and charities, so bigger groups, to work in a more collaborative fashion as well. And we used the Make It Happen model, but with much larger sums of money. And some of the criteria around receiving funding was around ensuring there was collaborative practice there, so no single organisation would get funding on their own. And also ensuring that people and communities were at the centre of those projects and programmes. So there's different ways of using money to invest in the voluntary and community sector and in communities. And some of those ways really support collaboration and stronger, resilient communities. And some of them encourage competition. And I think it's really important that as commissioners or officers with access to public funds that are spent in that way, that we're thinking about how we go about spending this money and using it as an investment in the communities as much as we possibly can.
So you made some points where my head's kind of going into a couple of directions, which is like really good, because I think you're making some exciting points when I'm thinking in my head now, I've got people where they're starting a CIC in the last sort of 10 years of just watching this space. You know, everyone's starting something, starting a charity, starting a CIC, starting a voluntary organization. And you're speaking a lot about competition versus cooperation. And really, I'm very interested in you maybe highlighting, and, you know, if you're allowed to speak as an individual, what are your frustrations that you see in this world of competition versus collaboration? And then I want to go deeper, because I suppose there's a yin and yang to the both sides, you know, but what are your immediate frustrations, but also what are the limitations in some of the ambitions you've got?
Yeah, I think, I mean, some of the challenges we faced with the Voluntary Sector Innovation Fund was that some groups were very stuck in working in the way that they'd already worked. They'd previously worked for the last 20 years or so, and they didn't see any reason to work any differently. They were quite happy with what they were doing in the way they were doing it, with the people that they were serving. And the introduction of this approach, which meant that they effectively needed to work differently in order to access any funding, was a big frustration for them, actually. And unfortunately, some of those services and groups didn't survive, because it was at a time when there were reductions in budgets and sort of money available to invest. But equally, what we saw was a number of groups and organisations really stepping up to the mark and saying, actually, this way of working really makes sense. We want to collaborate. We can see the value of working together and bringing different things to the table, and ensuring that people's voices and lived experiences are at the centre of everything we're doing. And those are the groups and organisations that have really sort of benefited from this approach and got stronger and been able to flex and adapt to the new world that we're living and working in now, and will be more sustainable ultimately. So I think it's really important to be mindful that things move on and we can't always do things in the way that we've done them in the past. And actually, there might be better ways of doing things.
100%. And what kind of at the other end, what might be those limitations that obviously, I think it's good, it's aspirational, and it sounds obvious. So where do you think some of those limitations occur that's not allowing more of that collaboration to occur?
I think some of it is down to people and their personalities. Maybe it might be down to their boards or their trustees. In terms of organisations such as the council, statutory sector organisations, it can be to do with targets that we have to meet, the way that funding streams are set up, expectations of people in the system. All of those things can sometimes make it difficult for people working on the front line in communities to collaborate, because they may feel they need to demonstrate the value of what they or their organisation are doing. But I think if we're really committed to putting communities and people first and doing the best for them, we need to challenge some of those limitations sometimes in the right way, of course, and demonstrate the real value and benefit of working collectively together. Because from a community's point of view, there's nothing worse than having different people parachuting with different agendas or similar agendas, but not talking to each other, maybe engaging people, working in the area for a few years, and then when the funding runs out, they disappear. That's not a good way to work with communities in their personal spaces. So we have a duty really as people working in community spaces to work together and to make sure that that community is at the centre of everything we do.
And there's something that you said there, and I'm gonna kind of just present a logic point that I've been coming across and I've been seeing a little bit. So the idea about sometimes you get the same repeat applications, you get the same, maybe a project and it's extended, and very importantly, as you said, when the money stops, that project stops. So I want to kind of just posit this area of thinking, which and I'm saying it because I want us to have those two thoughts in our heads. So I want you to find where you can just what your feeling around this is, whether professionally or personally. But one phrase is that sometimes you've got to work with government funding and treat it like startup money, but never treat it like it's your salary, like you're expecting it after 3 years, that sometimes you've got to kind of treat it as, I got the money now to start, but I've got to now make sure I find other ways to sustain it, whether I start to monetize it in a particular way, or I'm going to other funders. And then and this is very much from the corporate world, I've got to start thinking in terms of investment rounds, like find the next lot of people to like this idea. How does that sound to you? Because you take one side and then I'll find the opposite side. But because I think it can feel antagonistic, but I also think it can be very what are your thoughts before I start to?
Well, that was one element that we built into the Voluntary Sector Innovation Fund, was that we really wanted projects and groups and organisations to be thinking about that future sustainability, because we don't know what the future holds in terms of funding, and it's they need to be thinking about that going forward, and thinking about how they can use the money that they've got now to demonstrate the value of what they're doing, so that they're in a strong position to pull other funding in. But equally, things aren't always about funding, are they? I mean, people need funding for certain things, but actually if they're working in collaboration and they're working with communities at the centre of everything they do, lots of things can be done with less resources. So it's just thinking creatively about how to do things and making sure that, we're not spending money on things where you don't need to, because actually that means that it's more difficult to be sustainable in the future. And it's you become dependent on funding that may not be there.
Are you allowed to name and shame? Obviously not actual organizations, but when you talk about spending on things that you didn't need to spend to, I could see something in your eyes that was like there was some story. So do you want to give 2 or 3 examples of things that you've seen people spend on that was maybe that was a priority?
Maybe I don't know, buying things for projects that actually, if you spoke to the people involved, they wouldn't say that they needed those in order to take part, for example.
What about office space? Because sometimes people
Yeah,
spend a lot of
I mean, venues, obviously, if you're running activities from community centres and things, there's overhead costs. I understand that. We want to keep these centres open. But just sometimes I think people feel the need, if there's, going back to your previous point about the amounts of money available for groups to apply through the Youth Opportunities Funding Programme, if they see that you can apply for a grant of up to £50,000, then some people will put in an application for £50,000, whether they need that amount of money or not. So I suppose what I'm saying is it's really great to see groups and organisations thinking about what they actually need money for and what they can achieve by connecting with and utilising existing resources in the area and working together.
Yeah. And as you said, it is. So I kind of interjected with that question just because, like I said, I could see in your eyes that you had stories. But the other part of that story is the ones where you've got, and again, well, I won't name brands, but people will get a certain type of device that's very known for being cool, slick, design ready. However, it's not always easy to repair, right? And little things like that. People get a certain technology without having all the expertise behind the scenes to work on repair and maintenance, etc. So all of a sudden, your laptops, your XPads, or whatever are obsolete, etc. So going into that kind of angle of, look at, as I say, as a commissioner that initially kind of highlighted this line of thinking to say, sometimes you've got to think about government funding as startup funding. It's not there for reliance. It's not there for, you just can't rely on it. You don't know when it's going to come and go. So now I've kind of echoed that in some rooms, and it was then perceived a little bit like, why don't you think people are going to continue to support us? Or it was echoed almost like it was received with kind of cynicism. But what I think you're highlighting is that this is actually pragmatic. It's very pragmatic to think like this, that no matter how well-intended a commissioner is, no matter how well-intended a fund type is, you just never know. You know what I mean? And
And I think the other point to note is I really passionately believe that it's better to work in this way. You get better outcomes by encouraging collaboration and sharing of resources and working together. You're building stronger, more connected, resilient communities, and community groups and voluntary organisations and CICs and all the rest of it are part of that. So it just makes sense. It's not just about the money and the fact that there may not be much in the future. It's about the fact that you do actually get better outcomes.
As you're talking about that, the importance of everyone working together. So can you give examples of what traits or characteristics do you think make certain partnerships work, and also vice versa? Because, very interestingly, some of my background around behavioral psychology is all about, like, how do you get good partnerships, but also how do you avoid groupthink? And I think naturally, sometimes partnerships are actually, in brackets, a clique. You know what I mean? But let's talk about what are the good examples that you've seen out there. What traits, what characteristics, what patterns do you see in good partnerships?
Yeah, I think where people have got a shared sort of commitment to working together within a community for the benefit of that community, and they understand that community, and those people are kind of at the center of the work that they're doing, that really helps, because that is the thing that should be the driving force that brings people together. I think it's really important to be able to have sort of respectful challenge when you're working with people, so that you don't have to just work with people who think like you and agree with you. This is about bringing different things to the table and sharing the different skills and ideas and expertise that you've got, and growing something that is sort of greater than what you can do by yourself. So that respectful challenge is really important. And I suppose having the maturity for people to take that on board in the right way and use it to strengthen what they're doing. And that's not always a skill that everybody has, is it? yeah, as I said, the commitment to understanding the community and working with a shared set of values and beliefs around what is important and why, really. And I think, yeah, not trying to sort of build an empire for yourself, I guess. Understanding that the community are what is important.
And I think my version of that is build with the people in mind. Start with the people,
Yeah,
and literally build with them all along. And I think, as you're kind of saying, in there means that there are going to be nuances. And already, I suppose one circumstance where maybe certain partnerships wouldn't work is if some people aren't starting with the people in mind, right?
mm-hmm.
Are there other circumstances where you can see why partnerships don't work?
I think where the focus is on furthering the sort of agenda of that organisation by either trying to make a sort of position for themselves within a community or create a role for themselves, or by trying to get the funding that is available within a community. So again, it becomes more about the organisation rather than about the people in that community, and that can be a problem because ultimately the focus isn't on the right thing then. I think it's down to building trusted relationships, isn't it, a lot of the time? And it's difficult to work together collaboratively if you haven't spent the time getting to know other people and building that trust, because you've got to feel confident sort of sharing and working together, and that takes time.
And I think the biggest thing, not the biggest thing, but one thing I've definitely seen is that those that have a mentality of abundance behave quite differently to those with a mentality of scarcity. But maybe not even just mentality; it's also some people's realities. And this is I'm about to cross two really interesting points of observation. So I lived experienced practitioners that have still got underlying traumas, have been very good at being passionate enough to be visible, make noise. So the experiences from, lived experience of different types of violence, different types of poverty, different types of challenges, those people have a grit and a grind that has been very good at them being kind of prominent and visible. But when it comes to project working, part of their trauma is linked with scarcity. So they only have ever known how to hustle and how to kind of struggle and things like that. And then when you then get some people where they're in the abundance mindset, maybe because somewhere along the line they're making money elsewhere, or their why is very different. I use a phrase, there's some people that are willing to eat last. So when you get those two worlds that clash, sometimes their relationships break down, because the people that are willing to wait 7, 8, 10 years for a project to manifest don't understand the mindset of the scarcity people, because sometimes they're like, well, I just need to, and some people literally are running a social enterprise and they need to pay rent. They need to make rent. So I do think that sometimes inside there's a room or a power of behavioral psychology. And this is some of the things I'm working on to almost not predict, but to shape the longevity and vibrancy of a collaboration. Because the frustration of some people as well with that lived experiences, they get frustrated about meetings. And this is again something that we hear from both young people. Young people's more interesting, especially young adults. They finished uni, they finished their master's, PhD, whatever it is, or they've just kind of got in a world where I'm around some guys that they just run their own events, and they've been doing some great work. Then you want to bring them into the world of people that want to partner with them, and they don't get why. This is their quote. I don't get why we just had 13 meetings and nothing's gone on. You know what I mean? So there is that kind of world of, like I say, abundance versus scarcity is kind of one area. One area that I think is interesting as a challenge, and I'm open to your thoughts on this, is mental health and, like I said, unresolved traumas. For some people, there are certain things in the process of funding, commissioning, some things in the process of working with a range of due diligence expectations, some of those steps are very triggering because it reminds them of maybe times where they had to go to court, work with law firms or work with solicitors, constantly having to account for things. And for them, it feels like it's just common sense. And it kind of triggers their mental health. It triggers their anxiety because it's like just constant having to fight. Have you seen any kind of partnership breakdowns where this is now aside from, the empire stuff, where some people just, in terms of their own personal development, they're struggling anyway, and that affects partnerships? Have you come across any of those challenges, any kind of commissioning feedback over the years?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I haven't probably got close enough to certain people to make the connection between what you've just described and their behaviours. But, hearing you talk about it in that way, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, one thing we did with the Voluntary Sector Innovation Fund, again, was have a completely different approach to how we monitored the outcomes from the projects. So the projects decided which outcomes they were going to focus on. They only had 2 or 3. The outcomes were ones that were developed through a really big storytelling project that we did with people across the borough to find out what is important for their health and well-being. And it was quite light touch monitoring and evaluation in the sense that they could decide how they demonstrated the impact and the outcomes, whether that was through video diaries, case studies, reports, however they wanted to do it, really. So I do think it's really important to look at the processes that we put into place and be proportionate about them. Obviously, it's public sector money. We've got to be accountable for it. We've got to make sure it's being used in the right ways. But there are lots of different ways that you can do that without having, lots of data and tables and reports and things, which are not always the easiest way to capture the real outcomes actually of some of these projects as well.
Yeah, okay. And that's really, a strong point that, it is public sector money. A lot of people are working to, make sure that kind of money does stretch and, considering all the things that we've spoken about. So in there, where do you think, I suppose this is a certain type of question, when commissioning, and how do commissioning conversations consider avoiding clicks and avoiding the kind of the usual suspect always getting an opportunity? Is there things that is that ever talked about?
Well, again, your sort of typical traditional procurement processes and commissioning arrangements are very structured, aren't they? They're very structured in terms of the application process, the criteria, how the applications are scored, and it's very a rigorous process. What we were trying to do through the Voluntary Sector Innovation Fund was obviously maintain that rigour where required, but in a much more sort of open way, I suppose, in the sense that we had projects put forward their ideas. They came and did sort of speed dating sessions to talk to the commissioners and other colleagues about their idea. So you could get to meet the people, get a real sense of what was driving their work. And then their sort of project ideas were assessed by a panel which included elected members, council officers, partners from the voluntary sector, residents, young people. It was a really good cross-section of people who discussed each of the projects and the sort of value and merits of them and how they were going to use that public resource and the outcomes they were hoping to achieve. So there's different ways of commissioning. We were really trying to demonstrate a different way of doing it. It's difficult to sustain that. It was seen as a really successful programme. A lot of people in the voluntary community sector still talk about it now and say, it was like a breath of fresh air, really. But as I said, these programmes are difficult to embed and difficult to sustain.
Tell us more about that, because I think that's going to be a really relatable point for people, because you now have literally highlighted that even you guys trying to break the mold even that's hard to sustain. And I think a lot of communities will relate to that, right? So just tell us a bit about why was it so unique? Why is it hard to sustain? And what are the odds of it being able to come back? What's needed? What environment, what soil do you need for this type of good thing to come back?
I mean, the reason it was a success really was because at the time there were key people within senior posts in the authority that backed it, that were open to trying something completely different. There were some funding pots available. There were some savings that had to be made. So there was less money overall to invest in the contracts and the services that had previously been commissioned. And rather than just cut services and continue with contracts as they were, but sort of, trim money around the edges, they said they were brave. They said, no, let's try something completely different, because actually we will have less money, but we could actually get more for that money by encouraging groups to work in different ways. So they trusted myself and my colleague really to create this programme of work. And it was based off the Make It Happen approach that I mentioned previously. But it was really successful because we had that engagement across the local authority. We had the engagement across the voluntary sector. It was a really sort of strong partnership approach. We had some money to invest in supporting people through a community of practice approach as well. So what we actually did was buddy up council officers with projects that had received funding, and we supported people through a community of practice to learn about strength-based, asset-based approaches and ways of working, and different ways of working with communities that put them at the centre of their work. So we were trying to shape practice for the future, as well as through using the money to shape how people worked.
Which goes back to, it's like you've just said, the idea is one thing. The beneficiaries need to be, at the center, but also whoever the operator is really matters. The team, whoever, It really matters that they're constantly up in their game. And I think that's a really important part, because lived experience might get you started, but that's not what's going to keep you in this sector for 20 years, or even any business, right? You're constantly getting to that next level. So I think that's really important that you mentioned that, and I wanted to elaborate on that, because I think that's a missing conversation. That getting started is arguably the easy part. Getting into the news is the easy part. Staying, effective and relevant is all about skills development whilst things are going. So please continue, sorry.
Yeah, so as I said, I mean, the real challenge is once you've tested an approach, we showed that it was effective and it worked, but embedding that is really difficult, because when the people who were championing that approach move on to other roles and positions, things quite often default back to how things have been in the past.
Right, and then there is the other side, the behavioral psychology of organizations, that fundamentally, rightly or wrongly, fundamentally, a lot of people will naturally play it safe. But whenever you get the couple of avant-garde people, when they're gone, they're really missed. So what would you say we can do to either keep them in their job role, chain them to their chair, or what can we do to almost still celebrate that? How can an organization keep the muscle memory of why the avant-garde people are just as valuable as, what we might call the accountants, as it were? Like, what can organizations do to make sure we protect that? Just so, when, I don't know, Jill created this, please, let's preserve it.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, we had COVID sort of off the back of the Voluntary Sector Innovation Fund initiative, and that was probably partly responsible for some of the people moving on to different roles. There was a lot of change in staff during the pandemic and following the pandemic. Lots of new people coming into roles, lots of temporary people in roles, and fewer people with that organisational memory and history of what's been done. So that certainly didn't help. But I don't know. I think it's about the people who are involved, finding ways of keeping that work alive and keeping a profile for it and championing it. And that can be difficult.
Do communities have a role in helping you to do that? And again, I know, this is my assumption. Like, it feels like you very much remember when that worked really well. And I'm just wondering, for people like you, what can we do to kind of help your voice in the room when you're saying, hey guys, back in, I don't know, this meeting random. And I guess I'm not talking about you specifically. I'm talking about people like you that have had a lot of that lived experience. You then want to kind of help, some of the successes remember that. Do community organizations have a role in helping you?
Yeah, I think so. I think the organisations that are part of that process who really valued it and still talk about it now will no doubt still have conversations about it with colleagues and commissioners. I think it's remembering, all of us remembering really when we have been part of something that's worked really well, remembering what that was like and what made it work really well, and using that to provide a bit of constructive challenge, I suppose, to processes that perhaps could be improved upon. I mean, funding often comes with a lot of restrictions, doesn't it, in terms of timescales, criteria, etc. And we've got funding currently for some programs of work, and actually the funders have been really great when we've gone back and said, look, we're developing this work from the community up and out. Really, it's emergent, the program is. We need to keep going a bit longer. We haven't spent much money yet. We need to carry some over. And if you don't ask, and if you don't share the reasons for needing to do that and the benefits that will come from doing that, then you don't know whether you'll be able to do it, do you? So there are rules and sort of timescales and regulations in place, but it's about having that open conversation.
Awesome. So there's two things I'm taking away, 100%. One is that sometimes when organizational change occurs, it can disrupt progressive thinking. I personally don't feel I've heard that a lot. I don't hear people really talking about that a lot. I hear a lot of people telling us about why things are changing and why organizations need to catch up. But I never hear people, like a bit like you're alluding to, really say, oh, but by the way, when things were good, certain changes may have occurred that have could have. So I think that's something that I'm definitely taking away to say, that because we talk a lot about change and change management, but actually we don't talk about how change has enough about how change disrupts good progress. We definitely talk about how change limits certain things, but I think you've brought a little nuance into that, if you got structured change, it's very, very challenging. But then you've also brought in that, well, actually, one of the ways to adjust and address that is the power of conversations, being able to speak to other commissioners and funders, etc. So organizationally and potentially process-wise, that's two areas. Are there any other areas where, good things can be protected?
I think it's just about creating a profile for things, isn't it? And sometimes when you're working in communities, you're just very busy working with the community. You don't always have the time or invest the time in explaining what you're doing and why and the impact of that and demonstrating that. And perhaps that's something that those of us working in communities need to focus a little bit more on, and trying to get people out into communities, actually, because it's really difficult for people to know what is best for people in our communities if they don't know who they are and what their lives are like. With the best will in the world, you can't, can you? And I would really love it if more people in senior roles particularly actually just took a walk down the street and stopped and talked to people, and just got a sense of what it was actually like to live in that area.
Amazing. Like, if you listen to enough of these podcasts, the theme that you will hear is the getting out of the office. It's both euphemistic and very just. It's a practical recommendation. It's just very true. So you're now sitting on our nerve that we're kind of really hearing from a lot of communities, which is please come out and meet us, please come and connect. And then you've also built a perfect segue to comms and communications, because fundamentally you're like, when you're doing good work, people need to hear about it. 100% we're guilty of not talking enough about what we do. And sometimes when we do, it's like, the project is kind of gone. Sometimes we have to be careful because we need a research period to have gone. We do a lot of research and insights. So the research period has to have gone, and then we kind of say what we've done. But, you're talking about talking up what you do, letting people know what you do, letting them know it works. Any recommendations or any things that you've seen that work for statutory organizations and commissioners like yourself, getting the message out there, and then any recommendations for communities to do the same to you, to help what's working for them on the ground.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would always say the best and most effective way of communicating with communities is through trusted relationships, and whether that is through your own staff, such as community development workers, or whether that is through working in a way with existing voluntary and community groups that they almost become the messengers or support with the comms and the engagement on your behalf, because people are much more receptive to communications and to messages if it comes from a trusted source, aren't they? And we found that with the COVID vaccination programme. Obviously, that was a time that people had to take a stronger stance in terms of delivering messages to keep everybody safe. But we know that there were certain communities who were not taking up the vaccination for lots of very different reasons. And so we worked with our public health teams to take a different approach to having conversations about COVID vaccinations. And rather than going out with all of the messages and more information, we actually just went out and spoke to people and found out what it was like for them. What were their experiences? What were they feeling? Were they scared? Were they worried about things? What did they want? Because it had become a bit one-sided. We were telling communities that they needed to do certain things to stay safe, but actually what they wanted to know about was, when is my buggy group going to start up again? When can I start going to the play group again? And having those sort of open, non-judgmental conversations and just talking to people was really, really invaluable. And that's actually really shaped the way that our infection control teams work with communities around a whole range of vaccination programs now.
And what's really powerful about what you said there is the power of research and insights, which is what we're trying to tell people, that fundamentally, until you understand all the circumstances that surround a thought, it's very hard for you to know what comms works. Because now, if you develop communications that shows getting this vaccination situation under control releases your buggy groups, releases, right? Now there's a relational why. But in absence of that, you'd assume, oh, everybody wants to just be alive. Do this so you can stay alive. But actually, for some people, it doesn't resonate, right? And I've seen it myself. And then people are like, oh, people just don't care about living. I'm like, no. You don't understand how people have got a hierarchy of thought, a hierarchy of responsibility. And even if we can't relate, it doesn't mean that they're stupid. It's just there's rules, and you need to respect that. And this is what research and insight does. And I think what you also highlighted, which is key, is you can't also research and insight in a lab. You need to go into everyone's natural environment, understand how everything looks, feels, smells, sounds, right? And then understand, okay, over here, we need to talk to people like this. However, over here, and this is where communications then get sophisticated, because you can't now have one marketing campaign. Sometimes you need 6 different messages, right? I mean, do you want to elaborate on that? Because it can be a bit of a headache as well. Like, do you want to elaborate on how you guys have been finding things out and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously with big programs like COVID vaccination or any other big programs, really, there's always the standard sort of comms campaigns, aren't there, that go out across the borough. And like you said, those will talk to some people, but they won't talk to a lot of people. And it is difficult because the comms team can't necessarily create 6 different campaigns to talk to different audiences. But then I think that's where the value of community development workers and other frontline staff working in those communities is irreplaceable, really, because they are the people who've got the trusted relationships with those groups. They're talking to them on a regular basis. They can have conversations about things rather than just pushing out information. They can understand how it's being received, or understand what the barriers might be to somebody taking up an offer or acting on that communication. And they can just have honest conversations about it. And equally, they can hear about the challenges people might be facing in their lives and the priorities that they've got, which we may not know about otherwise. So I think you can't replace the value of that face-to-face communication. There's no other comms method, in my opinion, that can replace that.
Absolutely. I think that's correct. And I think this is also then the next tier from that is the power of micro influencers. As you said, whether it's community development workers, the point is that there's got to be credible people in that said community.
Yeah.
Leaders, but also now it's just online voices. So this is also where the social entrepreneur with that lived experience is powerful, because that's what they're really good at. They're great at galvanizing voice, they're great at galvanizing, but it doesn't always mean that they then need to be the number one running an organization, because that's a whole different math. And they can say, if you're willing to keep upskilling, you'll be fine. But for some people, that's just their limit. They're unbelievably great at getting people to follow them, and then they're now a really strong comms vehicle. And then in other spaces, it could be, everything from comedians to other people. And I think now there's a movement for people now appreciating barbershops, because before I didn't see it a lot, but now probably in the last 5 years, I feel people are saying, well, let's engage with the hairdressers, the nail salons and all of that. So this is about that, let's really have respect for what people really do versus, make it up and kind of think, oh, we put it on a billboard so everybody would have seen it. Or I love when people tell me that they've got a mailing list of X thousand, and I'm like, yeah, but you do know that all of them are other enterprises and or people that are just looking to hear from you when the next funding's about. So unless you put the right subject line, they're not opening anything, right? So I think that's where, you're right that it's not easy, but there is a formula, there's a skill, and it needs its own investment. And in a times where funding cuts are occurring, it's not always easy. Yeah, it's not always easy, but I do believe that there's lots of lateral ways of looking at it. Now, there's from that kind of area, we're going to be wrapping up, but I did feel I could resonate with that point around all the ways that we could laterally think about comms. I'm a big fan of micro influencers. I'm a big fan of find the people in the community that other people might look up to, and then have that conversation, which is where the partnership work is bilateral, because there are some people that don't know that they're an influencer, and they really, really are. There are some that are an influencer, but they really don't get it because they've never had to see this one. So a lot of my work is the pre-education, and I'm a big fan of meet people before you need them. Yeah, have the respect and the humility to be like, hey, I respect what you're doing. I don't know how we're going to work together yet, but first I just respect it. And then, over time we'll get it. This is one baby for you. One thing I'll find that's one of my strengths, as it were, is people really value the business insights and the things that I come with, and people value the fact that we've got a whole media arm. Now, that might be useful to you guys because it's like an exchange thing. Remember we said about partnerships and due respect. So it's not always, there's a project, there's a commission, come get paid. Sometimes it's me giving them half an hour of this is how you think for this, me giving them 45 minutes or a WhatsApp message, and sometimes it'll be my child's not well, they're struggling with their mental health, they're struggling with this. So part of that is also that give before you take as well. That's something I've definitely found is very useful. It's not all about what are we going to get, but it's like I say, I respect your thing. This is what I do. If it's useful to you, or I just like what you're doing and I hope it doesn't go away. So this is the contribution I can make. So that's part of my kind of way of looking at it. So finishing up, you as a commissioner, you've kind of given some amazing insights into things that I've worked before. You've given some honest insights into, limitations, the challenges and the struggles. So one kind of key thing is, what would you say is the most rewarding aspect of your work, and any advice you'd like to give listeners in terms of improving their communications and their engagement based on things that you've seen. So most rewarding aspect of your work, and any advice around commissioning, communications, or community engagement.
Yeah, I mean, as I've said before, it's just an absolute pleasure, really, and a privilege to work with people in their own spaces, in their communities. And I'm really fascinated by people and their lives and their sort of history and the choices they make and why they do the things they do. And I'm really interested in finding out what their hopes and aspirations are for the future and encouraging them to achieve those where they can, and enabling them to do that if I'm in a position to do so. So it's when that sort of results in people doing something as a result of those conversations or connections, then that is incredibly rewarding, because you can see people really sort of beginning to thrive and believe in themselves and believe that they can achieve the things that they want to achieve in their lives. Advice in terms of commissioning, I mean, I would always say you really need to get out and know your communities, know the groups that you're working with, know the services that they provide. It's fine receiving reports and talking to people, but just go out into their space and see what's happening, and begin to understand what life is like for the people delivering those activities and services, and for the people who are benefiting from them. And you can't gather that sort of insight and information and experience in any other way, in my opinion. In terms of comms, I mean, you've really got to understand people, haven't you? And you need to think about how messages will land with different communities, what's going on in their lives, and that links in with the community engagement angle then, because going back to the example earlier about the COVID vaccinations and the buggy walks, if we're putting out messages within communities to come for your health check, for example, but those people are struggling to find food to put on the table for their children that night, however motivated they may be to go for their health check and however important they might think it is, they're not going to go because they've got other things that have to take priority. So it's about thinking about what life is like to live in other people's shoes. It's difficult to do if you haven't got those sorts of experiences yourself. And that's why it's so important to listen to people's stories, to be curious, to be humble when you're working in communities, to be mindful of what's going on in other people's lives, and ultimately to start from a place where you really want to understand people rather than going in with an agenda that you want to share with people.
So start with the people and learn to be comfortable with whatever you find.
Yeah.
Whatever they tell you.
Yeah.
All right. So to close, any book recommendations in terms of this field and area for people that might be getting started in the program, or they want to get a little bit better or advance their knowledge and interest?
Well, a book that I've read fairly recently around working in communities is a book by Cormac Russell, who's known for asset-based community development work, and it's called Rekindling Democracy, and it's a professional's guide to working in citizen space. And it's a really thought-provoking book. It shares lots of different scenarios of working with people in communities in lots of different places around the world and lots of different contexts, and helps you think about how you behave when you go into communities and the impact of that, and also the way that you ask questions and phrase your communications with people, really, and the difference that can make. So it's definitely a good read.
Yeah, leaving questions open and not filling in the gaps for people.
Yeah, and walking alongside people rather than trying to lead people, I guess, or do things to people. Walking alongside people, recognising the strengths within people and within their communities and valuing those and building on those, and ultimately believing that people can be the creators of their own health and well-being, and how you can work in communities in that way to cultivate that, really.
Yeah, it feels very much like the answer is inside of all of us. Can you give us the spelling of his name? Cormac, is it C-K on the end?
C-O-R-M-A-C, Cormac Russell.
Russell. And the title of the book?
Rekindling Democracy.
Rekindling Democracy. Okay. Jody, Commissioner, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for the insights that you've been kind of sharing with us. And that is another episode of the Leading Communities podcast.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to keep up to date with all things Leading Communities. You can follow Aspire for You at A4UCIC. To follow That All Media, search at That All Media. You can also join us on Facebook at Leading Communities Podcast.